Welcome and thanks a lot to Professor Bolden for her interesting talk. It's a great honor for me to introduce our next guest speaker, Professor Dr. Aylin Küntay. Professor Küntay had her PhD degree in psychology from the University of Berkeley, California, and currently she is a faculty member at Koç University. Her research covers various aspects of language acquisition and communicative development, the interaction between cognitive and linguistic abilities, the narrative development, the acquisition of syntactic forms, and the use of gesture are only some of them. She also contributes to the construction of Turkish communicative development inventory, which fills an important gap in the assessment of Turkish-speaking children's linguistic and communication skills. Her studies with infants and children enhanced the understanding of the acquisition of language and provided valuable insight into the cognitive mechanisms underlying language production and comprehension. Today she will talk about referential communication and its implications in cognitive science. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Aylin Küntay.
Okay. Thanks for your patience and thanks for the nice introduction. I'm going to be talking about referential communication in children. I guess, I will leave it up to you and up to the discussion to discuss a little bit whether this work is kind of interesting for the general cognitive science. I've been doing developmental psychology and a little bit of mostly focused on language development. Okay, so what is referential communication? Referential communication, the way I define it, is simply communicating about things and people in the external environment. It is an ability at the core of human communication. It's something we do very often in everyday life. So although referring for the sake of referring is possible, even simple acts of reference such as this is a stapler, or here comes my dog Goofy, they serve larger social communicative functions such as introducing, new people or new, apparatuses to the addressee. And more often, we basically don't use just plain reference, we embed our referential terms in larger social communicative acts, such as action requests, like we ask people if they have a stapler, when we have a need for a stapler. And, if we lost our dog or something and we are looking for it, we might ask, did you see my dog around, right? Embedding the referential expression in a larger construction, basically. And if the speaker is in real search of his or her dog, there are different ways to ask for his dog. For example, if you are asking, did you see my dog around, you are assuming that your addressee is familiar with you and your relationship to your dog and how your dog looks like and so on. But if you ask if you ask a different linguistic term, did you see a dog around, right? You are using an indefinite noun phrase in that case. In that case, you're assuming your addressee doesn't know about your specific dog and so on, right? And you can, did you see Goofy around, using a proper term, assumes a different relationship between the speaker and addressee. Or, rather than asking, did you see a dog around, you could be more specific if you are really searching for your dog, and if you want to describe to a stranger how your dog looks like, you need to use richer referential expressions with modifiers and so on, such as, do you see a black dog with white spots? Okay, so as we saw in these examples, referential communication allow us to tailor different referential expressions with different linguistic properties for different addressee needs. Such a tailored use of possessive pronouns, proper names, indefinite expressions, or more complex referential expressions such as relative clauses, for example, relies on knowledge about vocabulary and morphosyntax, basically what we call linguistic knowledge, in addition to what we call pragmatic knowledge. The pragmatic knowledge in this domain, we can call it communicative perspective taking, which I could define right now as the ability to process and represent different perspectives in relation to the referent that you want to talk about. Okay, how about children? Most of our work in our lab is about children, although we study adults quite a bit too. So how do children fare in referring to external objects? I mean, if you have ordinary interactions with little toddlers, we often surprised about how referentially effective they could be, for example, in making us pick the right diaper among a heap of diapers. If they want the one with the cow picture on it, they are pretty vocal and insistent about it. So referential communication is mostly going and moving straightforwardly with these little kids. On the other hand, if you hang out with a little bit of older kids who are, telling narratives and so on, which I did for a couple of years in their naturalistic context, you're often lost when they retell a story about a movie that they have recently watched or something. They meander around a set of characters and they often lose you. Not all of them, but it's often the characteristic narrative of a little 4-year-old. So what is going on actually referentially speaking? So we observe that infants and toddlers are referentially more robust than preschoolers, right? Such as the comparison between the picky diaper picker, basically, and the film retailer. So there is a lot of research in the literature that toddlers are referentially pretty effective. They take the needs of their addressee into account in designing their referential forms and so on. But then when we put 4, 5, even sometimes 7-year-olds in situations, in experimental situations, where it's a bit complicated, they might fail. They actually underperform in relation to 9-year-olds and 9-year-olds even in relation to adults and so on. So what I think many factors distinguish the situation of the little diaper picker from the film narrator. So we need to understand what these differences are. This is what our research tries to do. So if we understand that, achieving reference-based interactions early on is really primordial for humans. So there's a level that we can do it. Even pre-verbal infants can achieve some referential interactions, but although more sophisticated mean more complex sociocognitive understanding, linguistic skills, and cognitive perspective taking needs to develop. So in the following, or in the general framework of our research about referential communication, we are trying to understand the conditions under which children are referentially effective and not. The studies that I will be talking about today I'll be talking about 2 sort of semi-experimental studies with preschoolers, and then mention briefly about an ongoing study that we've been doing in the naturalistic interactions of children younger than 2, really young children. All these are language production data, actually, and all involve Turkish. They've been conducted in Turkey. Okay. So the first study, in the first study that I'll talk about, we looked at the demonstrative pronouns and their conversational use by children at the age of 4, 6, and we compared them to adults. So for those of you who are not that familiar with linguistics, what are demonstrative pronouns? These are little linguistic elements such as this, that, here, and there, which we often use, right, to identify, to point at physically available things around us. And their meanings are not inherent, right? They are not like content words like bottle, for example. And if I want to refer to a bottle, I could use a demonstrative pronoun such as this, right, and show it to you. So, we have to do some action relevant to that entity to make the addressee understand what exactly we are referring to when we are using demonstrative pronouns. And if you've interacted with children, young children who are starting to speak, you hear them saying all the time this, that, bu, and bunu, and so forth. They use them quite a bit in their early interactions. Sometimes, some kids actually have a lot more demonstrative pronoun usage than content words early on. But the story is a little bit more complicated than that, right? So what makes children choose within the paradigm of demonstrative pronouns? What makes children choose this over that or that over this? So what are the dimensions that govern their use? So research with English-speaking children have been done, and it shows that children learn slowly to pay attention to the spatial location or the distance of the referent with respect to the speaker and addressee, and that's the dimension which basically distinguishes this from that in English. And it takes a while, but they learn pretty early this dimension. Now, more recently, typological linguists have been looking into non-Indo-European languages and have found some interesting things about how demonstrative pronouns work there. And the question is, what do these systems look like, and what kind of developmental challenges do they pose to the demonstrative pronoun learner, the little child in that case? So Turkish actually happens to be one of these languages which has an interesting demonstrative pronoun system. Okay, so think of Turkish for a while. Turkish learners, encounter a three-way demonstrative pronoun system in their language. Turkish includes bu and o, which roughly correspond to this and that in English, but there is a third pronoun, and shu is the third pronoun. It's kind of tricky to fit into the demonstrative pronoun system of English, let's say. So how does the Turkish demonstrative pronoun system look like? And we basically looked at a lot of adult conversations to figure this out. The Turkish grammar books explain it in slightly different ways. But if you look at the distinction between bu and o, this and that, it is true that what matters is the distance of the referent from the speaker, so that's bu and o. This is the distance dimension, but there is actually a second dimension. And that dimension has to do with the addressee's attentional status. And shu, as you see in the second column there, shu is only used when the addressee's attention is not yet on the referent. You could use shu to refer to objects that are very close to you, right? I can say shu remote control. I can refer to a mark on my body and say shu, or I could refer to a very far object like building in the horizon or that window or something to say shu too. So it's not really distance dependent. It really depends on the whether I want to attract my addressee's attention to the object or not. And that's what, when we examined adult conversations, doing art activities and so on, that's what we noticed. But I'm going to tell you more about the children's stuff that we did. And we used a method where we thought we could elicit demonstrative pronouns by children without, making it clear what we are eliciting. So we made them play with little blocks. This is these are the adult pictures. We collected the same set of data from adults as well. So they had a pictured model they were looking at, like a model of a house, and they were given blocks to build that house from. So basically, they could refer to that model, pictured model, and they could refer to these various blocks that are on their tabletop. And they would use a lot of demonstrative pronouns, which they actually did in our study. So these are some still pictures from the videos that we coded. What we coded for was which demonstrative was used among the three demonstrative pronouns bu, o, this, that, and shu. And we coded for the distance of the referent in relation to the speaker and the addressee, and the addressee's attentional state. Actually, visual attention in this case. Okay, so some results now. And this graph represents the percentage of usage of each of these demonstrative pronouns by 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and adults. Uses of bu, this, are on the left, uses of shu are in the middle, and uses of o are on the right. And the lightest columns refer to the adults. And if you look at this, first the adult distribution, you notice that in this Lego construction task, in this collaborative Lego construction task, adults were using shu quite a bit. And the children were using shu quite less than adults. So we found differences between children and adults. And the usage of o, for example, the distal pronoun, that kind of pronoun, it did not matter across age groups. Now, in relation to their function, okay, remember are sort of the two dimensions that we think govern the usage of demonstrative pronouns in the Turkish language. Basically, we have distance and we have the addressee's attentional status, whether the addressee's attention is on the referent or off the referent. So that's what these on-referent, off-referent, on-referent, off-referent refers to. So this is the proportion of usage of bu, this, by all three age groups, depending on whether the referent is near the speaker or far from the speaker. And also when the addressee's attention is on the referent or off the referent for each of these age groups. So as you see, children and adults tend to use both for near reference. These are marked by the darker bars in this graph. And whether the addressee's attention is focused on the referent or not does not matter, because bu doesn't encode that anyway. So all age groups seem to take distance into account in their choice of bu. And these are the O usages, so percentage of usage of O. And for O, as you see, the lighter bars prevail, which means that irrespective of the attentional status of their addressee, people of all ages seem to be using O for further reference. Okay? So they can use this distance dimension. Now, how about shu? This is the most Turkish specific or exotic pronoun, at least from the perspective of other languages. Here we actually found the difference between Turkish children and Turkish adults, Turkish learners basically. So when you look at adults' usage of shu, which are represented on the rightmost side here in this graph, these are the adults, we see that distance or nearness of farness of the referent does not matter. However, shu is most often used when the addressee's attention is not yet on the referent, which is off the referent basically. So adults seem to be using shu to call the addressee's referent on an object that is previously unattended to. Both child groups, these are 4 and 6-year-olds, were not respecting this dimension of the status of the addressee's attention. So it looks like shu is used with similar functions to bu, mostly for near reference, actually. And we also did sort of a follow-up. We wanted to see how Turkish moms, Turkish mothers, caregivers, who play with their kids, who are at the age of 3, refer to these Lego parks and the setup that we use, the same setup we use with a set of mothers and their 3-year-olds. Interestingly enough, if you compare the adults, the adults in our study, which are college students basically, to mothers, they actually show different kinds of patterns in their usage of demonstrative pronouns. Mothers, like their children, seem to be overusing bu slightly in this context. It was interesting actually to watch and code these videos the mothers were, they were actually interacting with children who were younger than our participants in the first experiment, but they were, bringing this, the object that they are holding, like a Lego part, to the attention of their child, rather than inviting the attention of the child towards the Lego. Maybe that made them overuse, the boo pronoun a little bit, so there could be an input effect. And we have to explore this a little bit, but there could be also, the reason for finding in the first experiment why children are behaving differently than adults could be a little bit about, these, subtle skills of communicative perspective taking are still developing. And when you are building conversations, fast-flowing conversations, in a Lego task or something with your peer, you're not yet at adult levels, even at a later age, like 6. Okay, so let me move on to another study that I want to talk about. This involves training of referential communication skills, explicit training of referential communication skills. I've been really interested in child-directed interaction and how it changes the course of language acquisition. So this is an experimental study which looks at that. This aim of the study was to get 3- and 4-year-olds to become referentially more effective in requesting pictures from adults. So when young children ask for help from adults, for example, to reach a specific picture that's not reachable, say on a high shelf, which is not reachable by the kid, right? They could point at the picture, which they do a lot. They jump up and down. They get really insistent. They can say this, that, and so on. But these kinds of linguistic expressions or mannerisms, nonverbal mannerisms basically, might not be effective all the time. So if there are other similar pictures, on that high shelf and so forth, languages allow us to build quite complex referential expressions. Okay, and one example is, the use of relative clauses, right? In a sentence such as "I want the ball that has the orange stripes." There is this that has the orange stripes, an embedded relative clause there. It has to describe a specific toy or a specific picture that you want, and it might distinguish it from all these other competitors. Now, relative clauses are quite complex linguistic constructions that allow speakers to uniquely identify a reference for their addressees, even in the most challenging situations with many similar objects to the one that you want to refer to. When we examine the naturalistic talk of children with their caregivers in actual video recorded or audio recorded data in German, English, and so on, we find that people have found that people like Diesel and Tomasello, Dan Slobin has looked into that. Relative clauses are not very, very common. And they actually, Dan Slobin has found they are quite rare in Turkish corpora. Russian had more, German had more, English had more in his analysis. And Slobin said that this late mastery of relative clauses could be due to the linguistic complexity of the relative clause construction in Turkish, which I won't get into the details right now. So in designing our study with these little kids, we thought that there might actually be other reasons than just linguistic complexity that make the acquisition of relative clauses slightly more complicated. And late mastery of relative clauses might have to do with more pragmatic, taking it into pragmatic reasons, taking into account addressee needs, and so on. So we designed a training study where we had a pre-test phase, a training phase, and a post-test phase in the procedure. I'm going to show you a video of the procedure, just a little video, but before that, let me just describe it to you. In the pre-test phase, we asked the children to request stickers to complete pages of a book. and this was to determine how children naturally ask for stickers before they receive any training. They had a book which had characters and a story, and they could compare their book to the version that an experimenter is holding, and they had characters and pictures missing from their version. And what they were encouraged to do is they were asked to go and ask for the right sticker that would make their book comparable to the experimenter, basically. So once the child did the pretest, basically requested for stickers spontaneously for a few trials, we made them go through a training phase where they sit next to an adult experimenter. They started filling out their books with the right stickers, and they were very good in choosing the right stickers at the age of 3 and 4. And then the experimenter, right after their selection, the experimenter provided them with some kind of a description, which we call training here. In the relative clause condition, the experimenter said, use the relative clause, so you selected the girl eating the cake. Keki yiyen kızı seçti. In the demonstrative noun condition, you selected that girl because there were competitors, which I don't get into the details of. There's another girl doing something else, among the stickers that he or she needs to choose the child. So you selected that girl, and the third condition was just a general positive feedback condition. Oh, you did a nice selection. Okay, so that was the experiment. Now I will try to show you the video, hopefully.
Şimdi Gökçe ablanın yanına. Gel buraya. Gel Mete'cim. Orada liste
Yine
bakalım.
ben onu istiyorum.
Hangisini?
Bunu istemiyorum, bunu istiyorum.
Bunu istemiyor musun?
İstiyorum. Hayır, sen.
Tamam. Bakayım. Gel bakalım. Hadi çevir bakalım. Ben de kitabını çevir. Şimdi neymiş eksik? Bak Mete'ciğim, bunu çizmemişler sana, gördün mü? Ama sen şimdi bulursun değil mi aynısını burada? Nerede o resmin aynısı? Evet. Ne var o resimde Mete? Evet bak. Bakalım mı resme bir? Bakalım ne varmış? Bak köpeği seven çocuğu seçtin, gördün mü? Yapıştıralım mı? Evet, dur bakalım nasıl yapıştıralım ama buradan çıkartacağız. Şimdi anlat ablaya resmi. Anlat, o da versin
Şimdi
sana.
ben havuç yiyen abi istiyorum.
Bunu istiyorsun.
Evet.
Al bakalım.
Yes, you might have noticed here this is a 32-month-old boy, actually, a little bit even younger than 3. What he did in the pretest was he was using a lot of these demonstrative pronouns like bunu istiyorum, şunu I want this, I want that, and the other one and so forth, which was ineffective, although we give him like 3 trials to do rephrasals and so on. Usually, some of them do better actually, but usually these young ones do not do it. And then he was the one who was in the relative clause condition, and he actually started producing productively these relative clauses in the post-test phase. And yes, I mean, he's cute and he was handpicked, of course, to show here. But this experimental manipulation actually worked for these kids at the age of both 3 and 4. We found that both 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds increased their usage of relative clauses from the pretest to the post-test when they were exposed to relative clauses during their training. So such a use in the use of relative clauses was not observed in the demonstrative noun phrase and the positive feedback condition. And I should actually point out that the pictures that were used in the pretest and the training and the post-test were different, although they involve similar characters and so on. The verbs that were required were different. So when the referential expression was used, relative clause was used in the post-test, it was a creative or productive one, basically. It wasn't heard in the training phase of the study. So basically, we can conclude here that the effect of the training of this relatively complex and relatively infrequent construction is nice, given how rare it is for young children to use relative clauses in their spontaneous conversations in Turkish. Maybe we're not catching the real context. I mean, when you record spontaneous conversations, you have a sampling issue there, which I do all the time. I look at spontaneous conversations of children to decide, to address certain questions, but there's a representational issue there. So when you do experiments like this, you might be able to show something else, how malleable their referential communication skills are. And if you actually look at, forget about relative clauses, but did these kids become referentially more transparent and effective in the post-test phase? If you do counts on that, right? Because not all of the post-training trials were answered in relative clauses, and I use abbreviations here. I'm sorry, relative clauses, demonstrative nouns, and positive feedback. And it turns out that kids benefited mostly in the relative clause training condition. The demonstrative pronoun condition had a marginally significant effect as well. I mean, one could speculate that you are doing some contrastive marking there when you say, oh, you chose that girl. Well done, or something like that. Okay, so, children's training studies of children's language and communication skills are pretty rare, especially when it comes to facilitation of learning of grammatical constructions and also pragmatic knowledge during early years. So we thought that by doing such studies, and we are actually carrying out some of them with my current PhD student who could be here, Berna, some of them, more studies about, training studies. Maybe we can boost children's referential communication skills if we give them somewhat of an engaging task, such as the sticker request task, and so on. Obviously, this has some implications for preschool programs, right, that are, at least in Europe and the US, they are really targeting to increase the referential, language and communication skills of children for school readiness and all that. So, okay. So, before I sort of stop, I just want to say that, although we carry out these experimental studies, reference is usually not only a one-turn event. You do your reference and you are done with it. And as in the case of the, this 5-year-old who is going to tell you about this recent film that he watched, he's going to meander through a lot of characters. He will have a long, stretching discourse for you. There is extended discourse. Also, in the diaper change situation, right? I mean, why does the little 2-year-old gets the diaper that he wants? Because there is, extended dialogue with the caregiver, which goes back and forth sometimes. So, what we have been doing recently is we are looking at these extended interactions that little toddlers have with their caregivers. And this is work that I've been doing with Beyza Teşşen, who is a PhD student at Koç University. And this is another example of looking at referential discourse here. And here, in the study that we are doing with Beyza Teşşen, we are expanding on an idea we developed with Dan Slobin, my PhD advisor, when we first looked at Turkish child-directed speech some years ago now, and we noticed that input to children included what we called variation sets. Variation sets meant that caregivers have a constant communicative intentions, such as, for example, making their child pour water, not on the floor, but go and pour it into the bathtub or something like that. They had a constant communicative intention, but they varied the form of their linguistic utterance in their discourse. Okay, here is an example of a variation set, for example, which is, yes, translated into English as well. So I sort of color-coded some words, some nouns here, water and bathtub, and verbs pour and take, which get repeated. And here, I can read it there, the mother is saying, "Git dökelim artık bu suyu, nereye dök, banyoya götür, kalk banyoya götür suyu. Go and let's just pour this water, go. Where should we pour it? Take it to the bathtub, stand up and take and pour the water to the bathtub." Right? It's the mother talking to a 2-year-old girl. You know, she has this constant communicative intention of, you know, making the child comply, and she keeps varying the linguistic structure in an interesting text. So there's repetition and variation stuff there. So what we are doing with Beyza is we are looking at referential variation sets, which we define as a sequence of moves with continued reference to a third-person object across 2 successive utterances in child-caregiver dialogues. And now because we are dealing with, with little kids, right? The kids, actually, the data we have starts from 12. So we have kids who are not yet producing a lot of language. We are actually looking at referential acts and gestures as well, as they are communicating. For example, this is an example of a referential variation set that revolves around the gift wrap, and the mother and the child are sitting there. They had just received a gift from the grandmother, and among many other toys in their living room, there is this gift wrap, and the mother now is talking about the gift wrap. "Sen bu paketi de seversin," meaning in addition to all these toys. So sen bu paketi de seversin. Şimdi kaldırmayalım paketi. Paketin kendisi de çok önemli değil mi? Bakar mısın? And then she says, "Buna bakar mısın? Çok güzel, senin gibi değil mi?" And stuff like that. So let me just try to translate this. You like this gift wrap as well. Let's not put this gift wrap away now. The gift wrap itself is very important, isn't it? Look at this, will you? Very smart looking, like you are smart looking as well. So this is what we consider to be a referential variation set, where you keep referring to the same entity, which is the gift wrap, using different referential forms, with different case marking and so on, and then you drop the noun and so forth. We are looking at all the complexities of noun dropping and so forth. But the more important point that I wanted to bring here is, there are lots of actions and gestures that make actually these referential acts transparent for the child, that are done by the caregiver, also done by the child. So it doesn't, at the beginning it's not very linguistic. So, for example, some new findings from this data is we looked at samples of child-caregiver interactions when the children were at 12 months, 17 months, and 21 months of age. As you can see here, before 21 months of age, at 12 and 17, most of the referential devices used by the children are gestures and functional acts. Gestures such as pointing at things, functional acts such as, showing things to the mother, and so on. But, they start conversations. Okay. So we basically, we found that with increasing age, and this is not a lot of increasing age, this is only 21 months of age, they are using more linguistic forms, obviously. So at at 21 months of age, they catch the patterns that their caregivers use, that they don't necessarily use just vocalizations and gestural acts, but they start to use linguistic forms. So I'm going to just conclude by saying that communicative competence requires a complex interplay of at least 2 types of knowledge. One has to do with learning all the linguistic devices, the full range of expressive options that your language or your languages offer to you, vocabulary, grammar, constructions, and so on. And the second type of knowledge is socio-cognitive ability, which is an ability to use these expressive options for different communicative goals and extended conversational discourse. And this is what we have been doing and calling cross-linguistic pragmatic development, actually. So I have probably less than 10 seconds or so right now. And I'm going to conclude and open it for discussion. Before I do that, I really want to thank both former and current members of the Language and Communication Development Lab at Koç University, colleagues at Koç University and Utrecht Universities, funding agencies, and the International Association for the Study of Child Language. I gave an expanded version of this talk there in Amsterdam last summer. So sorry for the overlap for a few of you at least who were there. And of course, you know, the organizers here, thanks for inviting me here and letting me give this talk, sharing my work with you. Thanks very much.
My comment concerns the distinction between bo and shu, the two deictics. Just to give a little background for the audience, when it comes to discourse deics, there's a clear semantic distinction that, you know, bo is somewhat backward-looking, shu is forward-looking. If you insert a sentence like "I hurt you because of this," if in Turkish you use bu, then the reason should already be given in the backward discourse. But if you use shu, then it means that you are going to give the reason. Right? Yeah, it's a little bit difficult when it comes to situation context, but my intuition, the faint intuition, is such that there is also this kind of directionality at a very abstract, perhaps an intentional level, that I seem to prefer shu for pointing at objects that's going to be a part of a plan, sort of, I'm entertaining at that moment. Again, in the situational context, at least my intuition goes, as far as my intuition goes, there is also some directional component. So the governing semantic thing seems to be not proximity, but direction, abstract. So are there any, so now comes the question finally, are there any, or do you think it might be helpful to have studies that, I know it's hard, but that could incorporate this kind of directionality in testing the differences?
Yes, I thought about them quite a bit, and the kinds of demonstrative pronouns that we have our data are the exophoric ones, which basically are about physical objects, and we had a few, you know, about discourse deics, and we had to, you know, in the adult data, we had to take them up. And I think that this basic distinction about, you know, I mean, demonstrative pronouns are attention getters anyway, right? Because you know, they are about, you're talking about things and you need to make your addressee pay attention to it. But in the shu one, you basically, when you're using it, you're starting with the assumption that your addressee is not with you there, and she or he will be with you in the future. Okay? And when you are using the sort of the distance-based demonstrative pronouns, you know, you're marking, you basically know what your addressee is looking at, and you are now marking the distance of the reference. So I think the discourse, you know, the axis usage, basically shu, being more forward-looking, like you said, might have to do something about that, some kind of an extension of what, you know, something more basic, or in a way something more early used, at least in acquisition. It could be related to that. It would be very interesting, obviously, to study this with children as well. Eventually they learn how to do such things, you know, in their oral and written discourse as well. So thanks for bringing me that. But we have to exclude a few cases from the adult data because we don't have anything comparable there. I mean, a few in the
Thank you, Aylin, very much for your talk. I have also a question about the demonstratives, bu and or. So bu is used for everything that is near and or for everything that is far away. However, if I remembered the setting of this brick building task, actually everything was near because it was in reaching distance and it was at the table. So there seem to be two kinds of dimensions involved here, the absolute distance and also the relative distance. And I wanted to know when children start kind of integrating or using flexibly these different scales, if something is near to them or further away, but yet within or among these scales something is relatively closer than something else.
Right, you're very right about this. The setup did not include, I mean, many terms towards external objects or pointing at things that are external to their task. And we could, and we have been thinking of doing such tasks as well. But what they do, I think, here in such a task is, you know, they still divide up this, domain, right? There's sort of a referential domain there. Okay, so there's the ones that are near me, there's the ones sort of relatively farther away from me, which is the addressee's part, maybe, right? So they seem to be shifting. They seem to be using both bu and o, high levels, basically. So, but you're very right, the distinction between absolute versus relative spatial distinctions could not be studied here with this task. And there are other tasks which we have been thinking about but didn't have a chance to implement yet. So, yeah, thank you. Thanks for bringing it up.
The study about the relative clauses. Is it on now? As far as I was able to see, children were able to come up with more relative clauses in the pre-test condition compared to the demonstrative pronouns. I think it's a good sign showing that they already discovered the function, referential function of relative clauses. And I'm just wondering if it would have been as easy if you had used object relative clauses rather than subject ones. I'm sure you would observe the priming effect, but it would be interesting to see the pre-test condition.
That they wouldn't use it as much.
Yeah.
I think you're very right. And one thing is, yes, I mean, in the sticker selection task really worked, right? In terms of eliciting relative clauses from some kids at least, they were using it in the pre-test, and the ones who were already using it in the pre-test did better in the post-test. So I have to tell you that the pre-test scores and the post-test scores are associated with one another. And yes, we are actually about to start this is the study that I sort of pointed out, Berna Aslanul
It's either we cut the poster session short or you discuss the questions. Okay, let's take one more.
I was wondering if in your research with children, if you've ever come across a difference in the process of learning between referential statements, basic statements, and statements using, say, proper names that are empty, that have no reference specifically in the actual world, such as fictional characters and so on and so forth, and statements that basically predicate empty names. Are there any difference in the process of learning in children when it comes to more abstract statements of such? Do they have more difficulty, or?
So proper names, like
Say, for example,
Winnie the Pooh or something like
exactly,
Pepe or something like that.
exactly, or any fictional character of such.
Well, I can't answer, with empirical data to that, but I know that they use quite a lot of references to proper names. Proper names, of course, to family members, neighbors, and friends, and so on. Also to fictional characters that I don't know about, right? I mean, years ago I collected a lot of narrative data from 4 and 5-year-olds, so I was in the US and I came back to Turkey and sort of moved into their culture, and I didn't know what they were talking about. They used the proper names, and these were all fictional characters that that they knew about, and so they don't have problems. I would say, but then of course you can test even in experimental paradigms how they combine it, in different linguistic constructions and so on. Could be something to test. So I'm not sure why you call it more abstract, necessarily fictional characters, because they refer to non-real or fictional entities.
Yes, because their references are not obvious in that sense.
Yeah. Okay.
I suggest we move to poster session.